what announcements do we have? Have any announcements today? IPSO representative?
Well, I guess we're in flux about.
Seminar and 3MT.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not in flux. We know the schedule for that,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So we've had to make some adjustments. 3MT, Department 3MT was going to be next week, but we had to change it to a week, one more week. So the Department 3MT will be February 7th. We're bringing one of our candidates for new hire. So we are hiring in our department a new faculty member. We would like everyone in our department, you'll see an email about this soon, to be here in person, if at all possible, next week. If you are going to be a student in fall semester and beyond, this will affect your life. Who our new faculty member is. So we want you here. Next week, we'll be hearing from our candidate, Stephanie Allen Egbert. Well qualified. You'll love meeting her. She's great. You'll just really love spending some time with her. So please make sure you're here in person if you can. Also participate then in the Department 3MT 2 weeks from today. Any other announcements? All right, well, we're really grateful to have Chris Critteden with us today, founder of a program called Sandbox, which is a cross-department, cross-college initiative, but housed in the Rollins Center over in the Mariah School. We have a lot of exciting things we can learn from him. We're grateful to have him. If you'll just join me in welcoming Chris to our seminar this afternoon.
Right. It's good to be here. It's funny, I was walking in. We're here. I was walking in, I was like, you can spend so much time on this campus, like never come in like some of his buildings. And then I had a memory that I have been here before. When I was an undergraduate student at BYU, I was an accounting major, which was a mistake. And I was so frustrated with like how uninspiring and how like, and the accounting program was great. Like it's a well-built program.
Soul sucking.
So accounting is soul sucking, but even like the way it was taught, I just felt like it could be so much better. And so I came over to this building saying, surely the people in this building must know how to like make the accounting program better, right? Not just the accounting program, but all of higher education. And so anyway, it was fun to remember that. And then like kind of full circle back what I'm doing now. Because I did not leave BYU and immediately start working on education. I actually took a very different route. So I went to a consulting firm. Was my first job out of school, and did normal like business consulting stuff. But the third year, I was able to do education specific consulting, and so we did work with like the U.S. Secretary of Education. President Obama was president at the time, so we worked with Arne Duncan. We worked with the Gates Foundation. Did a bunch of like really interesting things. A bunch of things that people now hate. One of them being Common Core, which if any of you have kids, you're familiar with that and how much it's not turned out to be very awesome. But so I started there, then I started a tech company. Well, actually it's not true. I went to get a PhD. And that gave me enough time to think that I dropped out and started a company. And I was also so poor that like going from like basically impoverished to like more impoverished was like easy to do when you're in school. And so started a tech company and was lucky enough to sell that to Walmart, and then did some other entrepreneurial things, and ultimately got to the point where I said, I want to go back and do what I really care about now. And I had the flexibility to do it. And I said, I wanted to come back to BYU and see if I could solve that problem that I walked into this building for, which was like, how do we make education better and cheaper? Was kind of my motivation when I came back to BYU. And for me, better, my slides are not beautiful. They're just working. Okay. But like for me, better means not just better, but I think like education is like the most human thing that we do, right? I don't know any other species that takes like 20 years out of their life to learn, right? And we should not come out of class and say, I hate school, right? Like my kids should not come home and complain about education, right? It should be something that inspires us. It's like this human thing, right? It should be amazing, right? And so that's what motivated me to come back and see, could I start to like experiment with some things on the inside? I can tell you a little bit about that journey. I'll also say like, feel free to interrupt and like ask questions. Like this is a really small group, which I love. And so this can be conversation. So Sandbox is the program I ultimately ended up launching here at BYU. So we've been running it. I know Annie was in the program. Has anyone heard of Sandbox prior to like the email that went out? Okay, cool. So we've been running at BYU now for 3 years. We're in our 3rd cohort, recruiting for our 4th. It's an 18 credit capstone program for business, engineering, and design students. So these students are getting credit inside of their major. This is not like an entrepreneurship minor or something like that. It's you're actually getting credit inside of your major to do Sandbox, right? And it's really cool because you're integrated with all of these students from all across campus to do it. You launch real companies in Sandbox in teams of 2 to 4. And we take you all the way from like team formation and ideation, all the way to launch and fundraising. And we've had quite a bit of success. So in the first 2 cohorts, we've had 6 companies get into Y Combinator. This is probably not the right audience. Do you know what Y Combinator is? We've heard of Sam Altman, sort of OpenAI. Okay, there you go. So Sam Altman is the CEO of OpenAI. Before that, ran Y Combinator. It's the most successful startup incubator probably in the world. They get like 40,000 applications a year. Companies like Airbnb, Stripe, DoorDash, Instacart, many others have all come out of Y Combinator. And we've had 6 Sandbox companies get in the last 2 years, which is like unheard of in terms of like acceptance rates. 7 Sandbox companies have been venture backed at a combined valuation of over $60 million. So these are kids that came in with like nothing into the start of the semester and left with only worth $5 to $10 million that they're now growing. But interesting to our conversation today is that's not why we started Sandbox. And nor is that like the real outcome that we actually care about coming out of Sandbox. What we really care about is this. So this is one of the recruiters that has hired some of our students, and not only the most prepared by a wide margin, but he's talking about this mindset change that happens in a student that comes through Sandbox. He's not talking about their technical skills. He's talking about this mindset change that happens through like an experiential program like this. This is also really nice. So we finally did our salary survey of our grads, and so if you want a Sandbox and you're a business student, you're 35% more than a normal BYU Marriott student, right? So pretty healthy salary boost. And again, I show this mostly to say that I think employers are recognizing that something fundamentally different is happening in this program in terms of skill creation that is not happening in a normal setting. As good as those programs are at BYU, the students coming out of Sandbox are having, I guess, more success, at least from a salary perspective. Okay. So the fundamental idea at Sandbox, and actually the problem we started with was not to start like a startup incubator. I love startups, that's my background, but it was to create experiential learning that was so real that it drove those outcomes, right? And so a lot of experiential learning uses case studies, or maybe you'll do a project for a company. All of those end up being a little bit artificial in some way. But when you're starting a company and you actually have the opportunity to build something that maybe has some value, it becomes real in a way that most experiential learning is not real. So I think that's what fundamentally sets Sandbox apart. And that they're spending so much time on it, right? So you think about a typical class, 3 credit hours, Sandbox is 18 credit hours, right? And so the amount of time you're able to put into it is just fundamentally different, right? And so rather than being one of many things that you're doing, Sandbox becomes the primary thing that you're doing. And that powers a level of learning that I think is just different, right, than most experiential learning. And on top of that, you're also working with interdisciplinary teams, which is how real teams in the real world work, right? You're not just a bunch of business students in the business school trying to start a company. You're working with what a real tech team would look like. So one of the big things, so I'm not going to talk to some of the mechanics of Sandbox, but this was the biggest, well, before I talk about this, let me just say, so we've been building Sandbox at BYU for the last 3 years, and which is really cool, and we've had these amazing outcomes, right? But there's one big problem. I want to guess what I view as a big problem with Sandbox? What do you think?
Maybe that not that many students can participate.
Yes, right? It only serves about 100 students a year, right? And I wanted to figure out how to serve like 100,000 students a year or 1 million students a year, right? And so that's what I actually want to talk about today, because that's actually what I'm working on now. I want to share some of the things that we're building, but also would love to hear your insights and comments on that. Before we get to that, though, I mean, I'll go back and talk about this. One of the big like insights for me, as I've been teaching at BYU for this is my 6th year at BYU, as we've been building Sandbox, is that education, maybe this is the wrong word, but I think it's as much a spiritual process as a mechanical one. Okay, and so I think, at least in education technology, like EdTech, which is like the places I'm more familiar, education is viewed as like, how do we transfer knowledge from like one brain to another brain, right? And that's certainly part of it, right? Like knowledge transfer, skills transfer is certainly part of what education is. But I think the real magic of Sandbox is that we understand that education is a spiritual process, right? It's this thing of how do you get a student to actually like wake up and start to engage in the experience in a way that they actually get the real learning, right? We call it internally the awakening, right? I guess maybe just like make this real. Like, how many of you, these are great grad students, but think back to your undergrad days. How many of you tried to get out of your general education courses as painlessly and as quickly as possible? Raise hands, be proud here, right? Some of you didn't, amazing. But a lot of you, right? A lot of your undergrad experience, at least, right? Was an exercise in like, how do I just get this done as quickly as possible, right? It's like, how do I jump the hoops? How do I check the boxes? How do I like look at that syllabus and like figure out how to get exactly the grade I want with as little work as possible, right? If I get just a little bit lower, how do I argue with my professor to get it just a little bit higher, right? Like, it has nothing to do with like the actual education, right? And when a student is in that mindset, learning is so much more difficult, right? And so we invest a lot, and I think we're getting better at this all the time, in the awakening, right? Which is like, how do you wake someone up, actually be here, right? Actually care in a way that they then learn, right? So a spiritual process as much as a mechanical one, right? And so we do all sorts of stuff. We think a lot about identity. I talk more about where we're headed now. We're actually investing a lot in identity. You know what I mean by identity? Like everything from like brand, right? To like, what does it mean to be a Sandbox alum, right? What is the like, who are the legends, who are whatever, right? There's all this identity around what it means to be part of something, right? You experience that probably a little to a degree, like at BYU, right? Like you probably identify to some degree with BYU, the institution, right? But we invest a lot in that, right? And then there's storytelling elements, right? Like how do you, what is the story that you're telling students, right? So they start to see themselves in a certain way, right? What are the rituals that we have inside of the program? Cohort is a big part of this. I think as people see other people having success in the cohort, they start to wake up in a way that maybe they wouldn't otherwise. It's really hard to really explain what this is, but we're going to talk about a bunch of mechanics, but I would just maybe making the point that I think this matters probably more than anything else we do in Sandbox in terms of driving those outcomes that we talked about at the beginning. Let me pause before I go anywhere. Any questions or thoughts before you going? Yeah.
Maybe you're gonna get into this, but as you put these teams together, like, how long do they have to come up with their idea? I mean, like, my husband's an entrepreneur, and so I've seen this process, and I feel like a semester is not very long. Is it a semester or is it a year?
2 semesters.
2 semesters. Okay, that's a little better.
A little bit, not much, right?
Yeah.
And I think so in any of these questions, like, again, what we say about Sandbox and experiential learning like this is that it's real, right? And so there is no forced deadline, right? They form their own teams and they break up a bunch of times. Did you break up with your team, Annie?
Yeah. Started with Bridge, ended on Zemo.
Yeah, right. That's right. Oh, that's right. I forgot that you ended up. Yeah. So the guiding principle is that like, how do we mimic what's happens in the real world as much as possible, right? And so in some of the things you cannot force, right? Now we can encourage people to work harder and spend more time, right? But like the process of coming up with a great idea takes as long as it takes, right? Say that it's due on November 15th, right? That's what, so real experiential learning, I think, has to mimic reality as much as possible. Other thoughts or questions before we keep going? Yeah.
Do you do anything like the IDEO stuff?
And so I'm not as familiar with, I know who IDEO is, but we do have frameworks that like we bring in and help them with. We tend to use like a broad array of frameworks simply because different people's brains work differently, right? But we've not used IDEOs specifically. Okay, I'll keep going. All right, so what do we do? What we're doing now is trying to say, how could we take what we've done for 100 kids and do it for, this is an arbitrary number, but for a really large number of people. And this is what really inspires me. So I was full-time at BYU until June. I was running the Rollins Center in addition to running Sandbox. In June, I stepped back to say, okay, I've learned all of these things. Now, how do I now take them and do them at scale, right? I went a very long, circuitous, winding path of deciding what to do. And ultimately came back and said, well, why don't we just scale Sandbox to many more universities, okay? So that's what I'm working on now. But to do that, we had to like invent a new model of how we could do this, right? And so obviously do something at scale, you're probably gonna need some sort of tech platform to do that. You guys are probably, I'm guessing, familiar with these two things. You guys actually know what a MOOC is, right? Great audience. Most people don't. You think about it like the MOOCs, right? Like what's the relationship there? It's like pre-recorded content, one student, one computer, right? Do you guys know the rough completion rate of a online MOOC course?
Good.
What's that?
3%.
That's lower than I've heard. I've heard about 7, but still basically terrible, right? So they don't work very well. This is like the new, yeah, you're lucky to get 10%. There you go. This is the new big thing. Like it's all hot right now, cohort-based courses. You guys familiar with these and what they are? Like, what's that? Yeah, Annie?
Yeah, an example is Campfire, actually. So Campfire is a company at Kiln and Lehigh, and the gist is they bring in managers from different companies and they have this cohort where, you know, you're mixing different experiences and you're all interacting together.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's like, it's kind of like, you know, professor in the middle. The professor is sometimes live, sometimes recorded, but the key element here is that they, you know, unlike a MOOC where you can start the course whenever you want, it's self-paced, whatever else. Here it's like there's a start date and there's an end date, right? So one of the big companies in the space is called Maven. Anyone heard of Maven? They just received a bunch of investment dollars. He was the same guy who started, I never had to say it, Udemy, that one, right? So he started Udemy, which was a MOOC. He saw this problem and said, I think the problem is like a human motivation problem. And so let's put people into these virtual cohorts with start and end dates and see if we can solve that. I think the evidence is saying that these are quite a bit more successful. But when I think of that, guess what I think of? I think of COVID, right? And I didn't like that experience, right? I don't know too many people that really did like that experience of going to class always in a virtual environment, right? One of the things that we know from Sandbox is that spiritual process is there's a big part of it that's human, right? And like actual human connection. I was talking to the president, who's heard of WGU, online university based here in Utah. So the president and I were talking the other day, and interestingly, they're looking at the research, so they're all online, right? And he was saying, you know, one thing that we're looking at pretty seriously is that there's the research coming out now that's showing that like our brains respond differently. If you and I had a conversation like we are now, well, not really having a conversation, I'm talking to you, but if we were talking to each other in person, my brain would react in different ways than if we had that same conversation over Zoom, right? What was the phrase? So I was looking at the research. Basically, like our brains just kind of like shut down to a low level when we have conversation online versus conversation in person, right? And so I intuited that from like my experience teaching in a real classroom. So when we came to solve this problem, we can't adopt either of these models. We need a third model that's different. And so what we're building now, like a hybrid model, And I'll show you kind of like a vision of what this looks like. But the idea is that people are in in-person cohorts on their campuses, but receiving content from like a global place, okay? The hope being that we can preserve the in-person power while leveraging the benefits of global scale, right? And so let me just talk about a couple of those things that we're building out and take some questions and give me your ideas. So there's three big things we're trying to unlock at global scale. So once you're now teaching not just 100 kids, but you're teaching 100,000 kids, you can now invest in the classroom in a way that you couldn't if it was just 100 students. You never could justify, I mean, I'm talking literal dollar investment. You can never justify the dollar investment that you have to make for these sorts of things if all you're teaching is 100 students, okay? And so I'm focusing on the global part. I'm not going to talk today about how we're going to preserve the strong human part here. I think you'll see some of that throughout, but the global part is kind of fun to think about. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so these are the three things we're talking about. So what does a global classroom look like? How we're using AI assessment and development to power human connection, I guess. And then third, we're calling integrated hiring. I've always believed that, I mean, a university does a lot of things, right? Developing the whole human being and all these sorts of things that I care deeply about. But a lot of a university is now preparing you for a career, right? And I believe that we shouldn't just be leaving that to chance, but we should be, as educators, we should be integrating with employers to ensure that when you graduate, you actually have a job. And so those are three of the many things that we're building, but I'll talk about each of those. Okay, so here's how we're imagining the global classroom. The thought is that you will show up to class in person, and on the screen will be your class. But this is not general conference or remotely streamed state conference, which is even worse, right? I'll show you how that's different in just a second. So take, for example, if we were, one of our sessions is on, how to pitch your company. The format of the class would be very much like a workshop-based thing. So there's stuff going on the screen. But the professor would then say, okay, one of the things of pitching a company is to be like very concisely describe what your company is in 50 characters or less, like 50 letters, right? And here's some pointers on what those things need to look like. Annie did this exercise, right? Here's some pointers on what that needs to look like. Now turn to your team and do this thing together, right? So now because they're in person, they can turn and do that, right? When they're done, they open up the Sandbox app and they put their response to the exercise into the app. And what we're excited about is now our large language models are trained to identify the types of responses that we want to showcase in the classroom, right? For example, when we do this exercise in particular, we tell the students you shouldn't be using lots of buzzwords or really marketing type language. We want concrete language. We can tell the large language model to find an example that made the mistake that we know someone made, right? Suppose that Annie was the person that was chosen. Her phone would then buzz and turn into like her selfie cam would turn on, and she would hold her phone up, and she would then be on the screen talking to the professor about their exercise, right? Does that make sense? How that works? And so the idea is like, rather than, a typical streamed class, there's real engagement between the people sitting in the room and the person on the screen. And this is just one example, right? So we also believe that like play is a part of this. And so we're building out some like games that you can like play as cohorts, right? That would just be fun. The way you would ask questions, right? So I do believe they're bad questions, right? I think they're bad class questions, right? No bad individual questions, but there's bad questions for the whole class to listen to. In a very similar way, now you'll be able to ask your question. The large language models can look at it and see if it's a question that'd be relevant to the entire class, right? And then those people can be called on to ask questions. So lots of really fun things that we're doing to be able to leverage a group of people sitting together, right? but also be able to make it really, really interactive. Yeah,
Why don't you just use a TA?
a TA.
Like, look at all the things coming in and like pick the good ones and the bad ones.
Okay, so you're streaming live to multiple campuses at the same time?
Oh, no, but you can still have one TA who's like,
You could.
Stuff.
I think we just don't believe that they would. I mean, I've done it. So
the
even,
AI is gonna be better than the TA.
yes, we do. Yeah, in terms of selecting the right answers, right? And you're also selecting across, I mean, theoretically, so we will be at 3 universities in September, hopefully 4, have our beta rollout. You know, at that point, you're talking about just their 400 students, right? And so selecting the right answer just becomes harder, right? And knowing which one to pick, right? And also having like an algorithm so that we want to make sure that all the campuses feel connected, right? And so an algorithm that says, hey, we haven't called on the BYU campus in a while, right? Like, let's make sure we select something from there. But yeah, I mean, that's a great MVP version. We may end up using some TA in that way. There will be a TA in the classroom, right? If for no other reason, we'll be quiet when it's time to start. So, yeah.
So like during Sandbox, I identified it with Sandbox as a BYU program.
Yeah,
Now that it's expanding to these different universities, it's becoming like its own separate entity.
yeah, it is, yeah. So yeah, so it'll be a separate entity from BYU that's then offering the program, all these services. There's not a lot of corollaries to that sort of thing. The closest example would be like ROTC, right? So it's like we've offered it most every university campus, right? But it's a separate entity that's offering that programming. Yeah.
So who employs the professor?
Who employs the professor? So Sandbox, the entity does, right? And then the universities are basically paying for access to the program.
Service, okay.
Yeah, it's like a subscription model to the program. Although I will say like the model in Sandbox has always been to bring in experts on those subjects. And one of the things we're excited about at scale is that the type of branding expert I can get to come to BYU is good. The type of branding expert you can get to come talk to 10,000 people is like really good, right? We call it like the podcast effect, right? The bigger your podcast is, the more interest people have in coming to talk to it. Yeah.
Just a kind of an administrative question. Are you encountering any challenges with aligning the class with several universities' outcomes or, their objectives and things like that?
Yeah, so we're a credit bearing program, right? And so the short answer is no, but the way we do that in Sandbox specifically is that almost every major that we integrate with has like one of 4 types of courses. They have capstone courses, they have internship courses, they have just general electives that are very, very flexible, and then they have like special topics. We call them R courses at BYU, right? And so basically just tap into those credit hours. And so we've now looked at least a dozen universities, and it's worked at all those places. There are some other challenges around, like I thought you were going to go around the scheduling piece, because like all universities have different start and end dates and different spring breaks and all that kind of stuff. Classroom availability. So those are things that we just feel like we're going to figure out. So yeah.
Have you considered putting like verifiable credentials, open badges within this as well to capture some of those things that they learn?
Yes. So that gets to like maybe the next piece here. So actually it's not in my slides, but maybe I'm not sure this is exactly what you're saying, but one of the things we're really excited about is what we're calling our model of one, which is that since your experience is being mediated via this tech platform, there's all of this individual data that we're able to capture about you. So in the Sandbox app, for example, there's like chat, right? Where you can like chat with your teammates, and there's like an engineering channel, right? Right now it's in Slack. But we're actually able to see that communication. Obviously not the private communication. I don't think we would read that. But if you're chatting in an engineering channel and answering questions for other people, suddenly we have a bunch of data on you about how helpful you are to other people, how insightful were your answers to these people that ask questions, right? That you wouldn't normally be capturing in a classroom, right? And that's just one example. Here, in this room, now every class exercise is being captured into the system, right? And now becomes another data point about you, right? This here, Every week now, so we haven't built this into the app yet, but so in our Slack channel now, every week you fill out this weekly report, right? Every class, you fill out a feedback form on the class. At this point, it's largely just to collect attendance. And then for us, we're always optimizing every class session to see which ones are good and which ones are bad, right? But all of these things are feeding into this model of you, right? That we can then use to do really cool stuff, right? So the example I'll show here, this is basically just based on this report here. So this is a report like, how's your team doing? Like, how are things progressing? Whatever else, right? This is real data, anonymized because you can't see the users because there's just user numbers here. But this is the large language model looking at that weekly report and identifying to us who needs help, right? And it's actually like quite good. So, student U04, right? Recently split waves with their team and is now trying to figure out where they can best lend their skills. It seems like they could use some guidance, right? And et cetera, down through these. The amazing thing about the models, I went back and looked at the raw data, and these were exactly the 5 students that I would have wanted to reach out to. Right? So we can then feed this data to mentors who are then going to reach out to the students and help them, right? But the data is also there for this, which is to basically say, today when you graduate from school, right, or when you finish a class, you have one data point on you. A letter grade, right? A, B, C, D, E, F, right? We will now have theoretically hundreds of data points on you that we could then, with your permission, expose to employers to help them understand who the right students to hire are. That make sense? Is that kind of what you're getting at, or?
Yeah, you'd have something a bit more tangible than an individual report, like, hey, this person contributes well, this person learned, really well how to market or do this and have it, they did these things, have the artifacts and a badge that they could post on their LinkedIn or whatever.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, you're talking like almost like a credential. Yeah. Yeah. So there's potential for that. One of the other obvious uses of the data set is like, how do you actually do grading at scale, right? And so we have, I think it's like a 14-page document of like all of the learning outcomes of Sandbox, right? And then lining up all of these data points to assess each of those learning outcomes, right? That you could then potentially turn into some sort of like badge or credential or whatever else. But for us, it'll eventually that'll get distilled down to a letter grade, unfortunately, because that's all that the university accepts. But then on the employer side, it will be this really, really rich data set for employers to find out who a good candidate would be. Other thoughts? Yeah.
When it was BYU version, did you distribute grades like on the curve, like the regular bell curve, or was it?
I've tried not to. I have a deep aversion to grades.
Me too, yeah.
Mostly because, again, like I think because they're so blunt, right? Like what does an A even mean? Like, what if you're exceptional in this way and really bad in this way, but exceptional in this way?
18 credits of C, like, that's really bad.
Right. And so at the BYU version, we started by giving everyone A's. We did that as long as they let us do it. And then we've moved towards some sort of forced grade distribution. So that's what we'll do at most universities. We'll say, hey, like, if you have a forced curve, like we can take our data and make it match that. If you don't, then we can treat it more like a pass fail. The system can be adaptive to whatever the university requires.
Do you think that's going to make students start jumping hoops and?
It's really hard. So I mean, so even I think so even this year with BYU is now forced to, I shouldn't say BYU. A person at BYU has forced us to well, the people who oversee the programs, right? They care about some of these things, right? And so they forced kind of a curve, and that's caused some issues, right? I think our goal is that if you look at our learning outcomes, is to make the learning outcomes as non-gameable as possible, right? And so like one of our learning outcomes is entrepreneurial mindset, right? How do you game that, right?
How do you measure that?
How do you measure it is the harder question. But I think, again, the thing that's being unlocked here is that because we have all these ambient signals coming in, right? And we have, the large language models can take text, right? And start to articulate that into an assessment, right? That a human could do as well. It would just take forever, right? So one of one of the things we'll be introducing next year is like calling it a meditation. Which it'll replace that weekly report. So at the end of the week, you'll open the app and it will guide you through this meditation of sorts that will pause every few moments and say, okay, now you need to write. Here's a prompt and you need to write for 5 minutes. And you can't go to the next thing. Like it just is going to sit there. You can choose not to write for 5 minutes, but you will just be doing nothing, right? And then we can take all of that rich language and we can feed it into the models to collect. Yeah.
Sorry if I'm getting off track. Stop me if I am. I feel like though, if I'm a student in this class and AI is giving me a grade for like 36 credit hours,
18, but yeah.
just 18 over the
It's 9 and 9.
oh, it's 9 and 9. Okay. That seems like a lawsuit waiting to happen.
Yeah. Well, so there's so the one thing I haven't talked about, there is still a human in the system. So every cohort will have a human being that will then look at those things and compare it against their assessment of how things have gone. Even though, so all the weekly reports, so that this example here feeds to that person on the ground, right? That would then be reaching out. So every cohort will still have a human being that's there. Our goal for them is though that person should only be doing like highly leveraged tasks, right? What I mean
by that,
what I mean by that is like sorry, high leverage tasks and that like I think the most valuable thing for a human being to do is one-on-one time with their students, right? And so they don't have to do content delivery, right? That's being handled by the platform. They don't have to do attendance tracking, right? That's being handled by the platform, right? They don't have to do any of those things that aren't high leverage, right? Everything they're doing is like one-on-one, right? Time. And so this report is telling them, okay, you're spending 10 hours a week on this. We want to make sure that's as useful as possible, right? Here are the people that we know you should be reaching out to, right? If there's someone else you think you should reach out to based on those things, then you can do that too, right? We're gonna help you to spend as much of your time doing that as possible, right? And so on the grading perspective, yeah, there's going to be a final screen. We're not just gonna just like AI straight to Learning Suite to post the grades, right? No, it'll actually come to a human being who will then look at those and say, this feels right, this doesn't feel right.
What's the process for like recruiting and look like? Like, are they still going to be doing a hackathon in order to get into the program?
Yeah, so one of the big, that's a great question. So today we be recruiting by spread the word, right? And then everyone has to come to basically what's called that's a one-day hackathon where they come and demonstrate their skills. They will still do that to an extent. They'll be submitting video submissions at the end of it that are then reviewed externally. But the thing we're excited about is that there's a lot of things that we couldn't do before. So one of the people on the team his background is in film. So he just sold his digital media company. His first film was on HBO. We think that film and storytelling is a really important part of how you scale emotional connection, right? And so in the recruiting process, we now have pretty cool materials, right, to help attract students we never could have invested in before. So that's kind of like top of the funnel, and then they'll kind of still go through a similar process, but now complicated with a tech backend. So, other questions or thoughts? That's what we're doing. Oh yeah,
I have all the questions, guys. Ask more questions. How big is your team?
there are 4 of us, small and mighty, and so. Yeah, so there's myself, there's a film kind of production person, right? Anyway, even just like the delivery of that class, we want it to be not just master class quality, but also just like super engaging, right? We talk about every minute being programmed, right? That won't be the case in the first semester. It's gonna be probably a lot more ad hoc, right? So there's him, and then there's 2 engineers on the team. Yeah.
How often are you wanting students to meet? Is that like once a week that they'll go to?
Yeah, so Sandbox, it's again, I mean, they only go to class twice a week.
Okay.
And they're getting 9 credits. The bulk of what they're doing is spending time together, right? And we know that one of the most important drivers of success in this program is how often your team actually gets together in person and spends time together. And so now in the Sandbox app, this is one of the features that actually is released, right? Is when you get up and meet up with your team, you actually check in on the app. So it checks to make sure you're in the same place. You check in and there's like a leaderboard that kind of keeps track of it, right? Yeah, yeah, so it's kind of just gauging how much time you're spending together. Yeah.
So I'm curious because so much of it is team-based and we know that teams are not always ideal.
Yes.
I mean, situations.
Yeah.
How do you help, especially at scale, how are you helping them to navigate that kind of challenge?
Yeah. So a couple of things. So one is that is increasing transparency around how teams are doing. So right now, if you're on a team that's not doing well, the process is you come to me in my office hours and you say, we're blowing out for whatever reason. We don't want to work together anymore. And I help you, I help you to find a new team, right? So I kind of know what's going on with the other teams, right? And so the first thing we're doing is to make it transparent to everyone of how teams are doing, right? So if you are able to get on the platform and see that this team is imploding, it may be a good time for you to like go reach out to that person and form a new team, right? So that first piece is just transparency. Just literally just knowing who's on what team is like a massive logistical challenge in today's world. But the app now will facilitate that, right? And one of our big signals is if you see a team that's been checking in, regularly spending a ton of time together, and suddenly it goes like this, we know something unhealthy has happened in that team, right? And we can then surface that to you, then you can just know to go reach out to them, right? But the second piece is there's gonna be this local person on the ground, right? Who's reading these reports every week, knowing that you got an issue on your team. When that comes through, he's gonna press the button to schedule time with you, right? And help you kind of talk through that piece. A lot of the time that I spend with students is on team dynamic, right? It's one of the big soft skills you get coming out of Sandbox is that you know how to work with hard people, right? You know how to have our hard conversations, you know how to like break up, you know, like, and so we think that piece, that very, very human piece will be the primary job of the person on the ground. Yeah.
Do you have like shadow teams that form before an implosion or like
Shadow teams that form? Tell me what you mean by that. Like
well, like so
they
you have
start-
like the official teams, but then people start like kind of like, hey,
oh yeah, all the time.
like
Yeah,
it's
100%,
just
yeah.
like this.
Yeah, they kind of like
Like
start
Survivor.
talking and then they do the breakup later. Yeah.
Oh wow.
No, teams, I mean, again, because it's real, like, I mean, in a normal classroom setting, you would end up on a team, right? And you'd be stuck on that team for the entire period and there'd be no choice to change. We believe that like one of the important skills is learning to navigate conflict, right? But also breakup, right? And all of those things. So some people in Sandbox will end up on 2, 3, 4, or 5 teams before the end, right?
You ever have like a point where they have to like commit to a team or something, or can like
There becomes a point where they,
I-
yeah, what tends to happen more is that there comes a point where a student realizes that they are not going to found their own company in Sandbox. And so then they start to say, okay, well, how do we make sure you have a good experience coming out of this? Which means like, if you're an engineer, how do you make sure you're on a team where you actually build something that matters that you can then talk about to a recruiter? And so what ends up happening is that people end up joining. You'll have these teams that are doing really, really well, right? And you'll have people kind of join their team almost as like an employee sort of thing on the team. One thing I will say that's cool about this, and again, like the power of the experiential learning like this is that it's so real, is that in a normal class project, right? When you have conflict, what do? Often people say, well, the semester's over in 2 weeks, right? It's not worth like, I'm not gonna go have that hard conversation because the semester's over and I'll just be on a new place after that, right? Or the project ends next week. I'm just gonna not deal with it, right? But this matters, right? These people they're looking at like actually starting something real, right? That potentially has some value. They know this is like not a 2-week project, this is a 10-year project potentially. And so it forces people to have the conversations that in a normal, more fake experiential learning setting, they would just not deal with, right? The students don't like it, but I delight every time like I see that happening, right? They just learn so much more. Yeah.
So it seems like this is a really great, especially capstone kind of experience.
Yeah.
But it'd be awesome if we could have experiential learning that is embedded throughout all of education, not just at your capstone. What ideas do you have for making that happen throughout the educational experience and not?
That's a good question. I mean, we've thought more about like, how do you apply this sort of experience across capstones? So this is like a engineering business design capstone, right? So we put a lot more thought into that of like, what would other capstone things be like? I'd have to think more about that. I mean, the one thing that we are thinking probably I'm not gonna answer your question. You should tell me what thoughts you have. I will tell you the one thing we are also thinking about is that I think there's a lot of applications for the technology we're building to other sorts of classrooms. So, you know, Utah State and UVU, who will be our partners next year, both have like broad interest in a global classroom like this, or in the AI tools in the classroom, right? So Utah State, I did not occur to me is that like because they're a land grant college, they have campuses all around the state, and they're already streaming class, right? And they're like, it's terrible, it's awful, right? Because it's just so one direction, right? And so we have thought about all of those things, but not how do you do experiential learning at a smaller, earlier in the process. Generally speaking, I've shied away from it because I really believe that like at least this kind of experiential learning needs to be deep and broad and a lot of time devoted to it, right? Like I think there's class projects and case studies that can be helpful, right? But I think everyone needs to go through an experience like this. We think about it like as the new senior year of college, right? Which is that there's some skill development, right? That needs to happen. You can't come into Sandbox without some level of skill development, right? You need some sort of base, right? But then the thought being is that your senior year, you would come into a Sandbox, right? That is this like midway point, right? Between the university and your profession, right? But if you got ideas about how to explain it other ways, let me know. So, did you have your hand raised?
So, from a student perspective, I think students would get really excited about this, you know, when you pitch it to them. What has been your experience when you try to introduce this to other institutions, universities, professors? What is their response like?
Shockingly, it's been good. I mean, we were obviously nervous. It's like to hear what they would say. We've yet to talk to a university that hasn't said yes. I'm trying to, yes, or let's keep talking, I should say. So so I think we're hoping that all the Utah schools or the big Utah schools are on starting in September. And then we've talked to University of Washington, Louisiana State, OC State, UC Davis. So kind of a broad smattering outside. We're very focused on doing it locally first, just because we think it's going to be insane come September trying to do this. And I want to be able to drive and like parachute in if like it's not going well, right? But it's gone well. I mean, I think so. What challenges do they see? So, one, the funding model is just a little tricky for them, right? It fits into their budgets, but my dream, we basically have priced it like it's a percentage of tuition, right? And it's a small fraction of tuition, right? So they're, you know, University of Utah, they're charging you $10,000, and we're charging like 15% of that for this, right? So like, where's the other 85% going? I don't know. But most universities don't, the funding does not follow the student, right? It goes into this big pot, and then like it's through this big algorithm, right? And so like if we want to charge on a per student basis, right? And so getting that sorted out has been tricky. So far they're all figuring it out. That's been a little bit tricky. I mean, the other thing is that there's obviously like a competition, right? And like, well, we're just outsourcing our education now to like somebody else. Is kind of the thing that you hear a lot. And we genuinely believe that like this is a collaboration with them, right? So we're inviting universities to be very involved in this as much as they want to. Now there are some, even at BYU, we saw different models. So like when we went to talk to computer science about Sandbox, they're like, this is amazing. You're telling me you'll teach our students 18 credits and we don't have to do anything. And we're like, I guess, and we would love you to be involved, but if you don't want to be, then they're now coming around. Or design, which was like, we'd love to be involved. You have like Doug Thomas, who's deeply, deeply involved, right? And so we built it to be accommodating of whatever. I think that's time, right?
About out of time, so let's thank Chris for his. Remember, we'll be back here next week for our faculty candidates, Stephanie Allen Egbert. Have to go get something to eat. Have a great afternoon and a great week, everyone.